Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Exodus 22:18. Welcome to another episode of Thou Shalt Not Suffer, the Witch Trial podcast. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack.
Today we get to talk to Malcolm Gaskill about his new book, The Ruin of All Witches.
Because you love the show, share it with your friends, family, and followers.
It's in the rearview mirror. Thanksgiving's coming up.
Looking forward to spending this month of thankfulness with you through several episodes.
Even if you're not one to do a big holiday feast, feast on some knowledge this year with your copy of The Ruin of All Witches, which you will forever cherish.
And trade your dessert out for another episode of Thou Shalt Not Suffer. Let your friend have that last slice of pie.
We're so excited to share this discussion with you today in this month of sharing. You'll feast on the wisdom of Malcolm Gaskill and learn about a truly wonderful book, The Ruin of All Witches.
I'm excited about that too, and I'm also excited about hearing some history from you.
The Connecticut Valley settlements of the early to mid 17th century included Saybrook in the south, Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor in Connecticut, along with Springfield, located 20 miles north of Windsor and under the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. All of these communities were connected through trade and migration. Especially connected were Windsor and Springfield, just 20 miles apart from each other. The flow of people and information was nearly constant. They had another thing in common too, which was they all had witch hunts around the same time. Between 1647 and 1663, witch hunting was in fashion, unfortunately, along the Connecticut River.
Thanks for sharing that, Josh. I'm sure many listeners are finding out, maybe for the first time, about the witch trials outside of Salem.
You're welcome. I know that they will learn something today from our next guest.
I am happy to introduce Malcolm Gaskill, Emeritus Professor of Early Modern History at the University of East Anglia. He is unquestionably one of Britain's leading experts in witchcraft history. His works include the highly acclaimed Witchfinders, a 17th century English tragedy, and Between Two Worlds, How the English Became Americans. Today we have the fortunate opportunity to spend this episode with him, digging into his just-released, unmatched New England witch trial book, The Ruin of All Witches. It has reached the top of the Times paperback nonfiction bestsellers list in the UK and is now number 2 in the Sunday Times. It will certainly be an equally high growing demand in the United States. The publisher describes The Ruin of All Witches as a gripping story of a family tragedy brought about by witch hunting in Puritan New England that combines history, anthropology, sociology, politics, theology, and psychology. You will be gripped by his telling of our important witch trial history as you are held fast by every page. So let's take advantage of the time we have with him and jump into this real-life fairy tale.
What drew you to this subject for a book?
I'm a historian of witchcraft. I've been working on the history of witchcraft for best part of 30 years. You're always looking for the next story, and I've done big overviews, and I've done some smaller stories, but there's something about this one, which is, it's just such a fine-grained, detailed story of a witch hunt. So it really enables you to get very close to the story and to the characters involved and actually see what the mechanics of a witch hunt are, the social, economic, cultural mechanics, really up close over a period of time. Because quite often with the history of witchcraft, we get these kind of big overviews and we can make assumptions about the way that witch hunts happen almost automatically. And I think when you look really close at a story like this, and the sources allow you to do that, you can see that people hesitate, and for a period of time they do nothing, and they almost contradict themselves. It becomes a very much more of a human story, I think. And it's just a very good insight into the way that our ancestors were probably a bit more like us than we think, in that they weren't always terribly sure of themselves. But even so, at Springfield, Massachusetts, they do still, in the end, all the factors come together and they do actually have a witch hunt.
We were talking the other day about how intimate this felt compared to those other books we've read, particularly about other Massachusetts witch trials. They've been more of a broad survey, and you don't get quite this level of detail. So it's quite refreshing to see that.
I think that's one of the things that drew me to the sources, is that you really do see the characters, and also they do, through their depositions that they make to William Pynchon, who is like the landlord and the magistrate, and he runs everything in Springfield. They do tell him how they feel. This is one of the really important things. So when you're trying to write this like a story, you don't have to kind of invent people's feelings or their nightmares or their dreams or their emotions, because they're actually set down in the record. And that does turn it into something which is much more novel-like, I suppose, much more fictive, more kind of cinematic. Those things were always there in all those other stories that you read about in the history of witchcraft, but you're just not always able to get down to ground level and actually peer into people's homes and listen into their conversations and really get that, as you say, that very kind of intimate sense of what these people's lives were like, and the ways in which they felt vulnerable, and the ways in which they felt afraid, and the way that they acted upon those fears.
You mentioned the mechanics of it, and now you're talking about the listening through the walls and hearing the story. I feel like those pieces really need to come together, especially for those interested in understanding and not just following the assumptions. So what you were able to do with that is so great for readers and researchers of all levels. I think it's going to be really important in helping so many individuals get to that next level of understanding their ancestors' experience, how it all comes together. So thanks for doing that.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm glad that it works, because, of course, you sit for a long time with the material and writing, and in the end, you talk yourself as a writer about whether it's really working. But I think the response from readers like yourself so far has been quite gratifying, that does come across. And it isn't just that we are somehow entertained or titillated by the intimacy of these stories, but actually it really does teach us something about the way that witch trials did take place. And actually also, I think, why quite a lot of the time they came to nothing. And that's almost a counterfactual, isn't it, in the history of witchcraft, that it's how do witch trials not happen? Because actually most of the time there are these preconditions there, but they just don't ever quite come to fruition. And the hesitancy in the characters in Springfield in the middle of the 17th century, I think, demonstrates the way that our ancestors are not these kind of crazed, hysterical automata who just naturally blame everything on witchcraft and then accuse the first person they don't like the look of. It's a much more slow, smouldering process towards an accusation. And even then, it's actually, as the book demonstrates, it's actually very difficult to make your suspicions come off, to turn them into accusations and to turn them into a prosecution and a conviction. We end up with a picture where almost everybody believes at some level in witchcraft, but the way in which those beliefs translate to a conviction where a witch is actually executed is an extremely tortuous and long and difficult path. And that at every stage, it's actually quite likely, from the perspective of the accuser, it's quite likely to result in failure.
You mentioned that this takes place in Springfield, Massachusetts. Can you give us a little background on the community?
Okay, so Springfield is not quite like most other New England Puritan communities. It's a godly town, but it's founded quite deliberately for trade and for profit. So William Pynchon, who is a migrant from England in the 1630s, is a trader in beaver fur. And he realizes that actually it's one thing to conduct trade on the eastern seaboard, but actually what you really need to do is to go 100 miles west, get yourself into the Connecticut Valley, get high up the Connecticut River, and actually then you can receive the beaver fur from source from the Native American trappers. And that's really his skill. So this is a very entrepreneurial town. It's a town which is built up from scratch by Pynchon, attracting the kinds of migrants that he needs in order to make his town function like a middle-sized English town of that time, where you need a division of labor, where you need farmers, but you also need cobblers, and you also need barrel makers, and you need tailors and everything, because everybody needs to be a cog in the machine to make it work. It's a kind of almost artificially constructed community with Pynchon at the head of it. And it's remote from Boston, which is the center of government. And there's a sense in which this town is rather isolated. And of course, there are other towns up and down the valley at this time. These people don't seem to like each other very much. There's a lot of conflict and tension between these communities. You certainly shouldn't get the idea that just because they all come from England, that somehow there's some sort of national fraternity between these people. In many ways, it's the opposite. It's the fact that they are actually very close to each other and in competition for resources and authority and trade and all those things. And so that if you go back to John Winthrop and the ideals of the city on the hill, the ideas of Christian charity that John Winthrop and the Great Migration of the 1630s was supposed to transplant in America. Rather ironically, these seem to be rather grasping, selfish, avaricious individuals and communities who are at war with their English neighbours, at war with local Native Americans, at war with the Dutch, and even within Springfield itself, as we discover in the book, that actually at war with one another within an individual neighborhood. So that some of those ideals of Christian love, Christian charity between neighbors are really rather turned on their head, because actually they seem to be rather selfish and actually have a lot of animosity for one another.
That makes me think about how Mary Lewis, I was thinking with the turmoil in her first marriage and then the church body that she was a part of, she was excited about her future, excited about her faith again, and she decides to go to New England. But then so quickly there is all of this fighting and stuff. I was just thinking how she really wanted to turn over a new leaf, but then when you get there and in that situation with all that it was taking to survive and to fight to get a new life going, it came back to that.
This is a story about hope. It's a story about high ideals. These are, whether these migrants from England, from Wales, from British Isles are Puritans who are going for religious reasons, or whether they're economic migrants, or whether it's a mixture of the two. You just don't get on a boat in 1630 to cross the Atlantic unless you've really got some very high hopes for the improvement in your own future. Now, an almost inevitable consequence of anyone whose hopes are that high is some degree of disappointment. And that actually that this is not a world where there is something for everybody. And this is particularly true in this area of spirituality and religion, because there are those who feel that they are quite convinced in their own hearts that they are chosen by God. They are, according to Calvinist theology, they are the elect. They are the ones who will reign as saints with Christ at the millennium. And they believe that implicitly. But when they get to New England, they then have to prove themselves all over again before their congregations that actually that God's grace is in their hearts and so on. And actually, sometimes the congregations are not convinced. And this causes, I say it's really beyond disappointment. I think there is certainly, we can see some cases where people suffer really quite extreme depression and maybe even have nervous breakdowns because that disappointment is so total. They feel totally spiritually broken and they feel they may never be accepted. And so that there may be something of that in Mary Lewis. Unfortunately, one great body of records. We don't have a Springfield of the Church record. So it's a little bit difficult to know who's in and who's out and who's struggling. But we know from other sources that she's definitely someone who's suffering from not only from a mental illness, but from spiritual turmoil. And of course, at that time, they could be almost one and the same thing, or at least they were fused together and you couldn't easily separate one from the other. Her personal experience of mental illness, I think, was in terms of terror and fear of the devil, the fear of her husband, but also a kind of a real sort of existential despair with herself that maybe actually she wasn't quite as spiritually worthy as she had imagined before she went to America. There is this history of disappointment, I think, to be written about New England as well as about success and triumph and fulfillment.
We've spoken a little about Mary Lewis and William Pynchon. The third main character in the story is Hugh Parsons. What can you tell us about Hugh?
Almost everything I can tell you about Hugh comes from the witch trial against him. His origins are obscure. He is almost certainly, I think, English rather than Welsh, and he probably goes over in the 1630s, as so many others do. And so many other people in Springfield, he is hired by William Pynchon because he has a particular skill and trade, and that is that he's a brickmaker. Now, in Springfield at this time, there are some who have a little bit of disposable income, want to differentiate themselves from their neighbours, want to show off a bit with some conspicuous consumption. And the way that you do that in this kind of timber-built town is you build yourself a brick chimney, which is a status symbol as well as being something that's practical, that stops your house being burned down, because the others have wooden and mud chimneys. Anyway, so that he has this particular skill. So Hugh Parsons arrives in Springfield in 1645 with a certain amount of authority and power. And actually, that those who want to order bricks from him and get them to build them in chimneys, well, you know, they're sort of at his beck and call. And of course, he falls out with them. He falls out with nearly all of them. And that this is a great source of friction in the town, which contributes to an impression of his character, which is, let's just say, it's more than negative. They despise and fear him. And he threatens people. So he is someone who doesn't fit into the community ideal. However, by the time really the more repellent aspects of his character become apparent, he has already married Mary Lewis. That's not a spoiler. And they're trying to build a life for themselves. But this is a life which, as for so many colonial families, was an extreme struggle. But there's something about the chemistry, this sort of toxic chemistry between their hopes and ideals and ambitions and their kind of underlying character, I think, which means that they will come to the worst kind of friction with one another as husband and wife, and together as a household will come into the worst kind of friction with their neighbours.
And speaking of Mary Parsons, there were two similar names. There's Mary Lewis Parsons and Mary Bliss Parsons. What do we need to know about that?
The first thing you know is it's incredibly annoying and confusing that people have the same names. When you're trying to actually no novelist would ever do it. It would be madness. But there we are. There are two Mary Parsons. There's Mary Lewis Parsons and there's Mary Bliss Parsons. Now, that we do need to talk about them both, and I do talk about them both in the book. I talk about Mary Bliss Parsons quite briefly, but she does need a mention. So that Mary Bliss has her family come from Devon in the west of England, and she ends up in Springfield. She marries a man called Joseph Parsons, who is, as we say, no relation to Hugh Parsons that we can determine. And that from about 1649, it's a bit obscure, but about 1649, it seems that actually she starts to deteriorate, as so many women do after her child dies. We sometimes have this idea that people in the 17th century, child mortality was so high that women didn't care particularly, or, when their children died. This is a complete myth, and that women suffer extremely emotionally when their children die. Her behavior becomes erratic and very strange. She starts leaving the house at night, causing her husband incredible consternation and fear and anger, actually. She starts being able to find lost and stolen goods. Now, back in Old England, this is what you would call a cunning woman. a kind of witch, a white witch, but still someone who seemed to be using powers that were not entirely natural. Now, her husband locks her in the cellar to try and stop her getting out, but this just, of course, antagonizes her tremendously, and she thinks she's locked down in this cellar with spirits. She feels that she's imprisoned in a world of spirits, and she even actually hallucinates. She's washing down by the brook, and she hallucinates this row of rag dolls, this incredible horror film moment where this row of rag dolls comes towards her. And actually, that so far she's not accused as a witch, but she will be, because it's like this world of negative spirits follows her around, so that in the end, the Parsons, they leave Springfield and they go and live in the fledgling community of Northampton. And what happens there? They fall out with their neighbours. The suspicions of witchcraft against Mary Bliss Parsons now divides the town. She is finally accused and tried for witchcraft. It goes on right into the 1670s until she is finally acquitted. But you see the way that just suspicions and feelings of witchcraft, you can follow a person around for their entire lives. And I think in her case, almost certainly connected to some kind of psychosis, which, of course, within this rather spiritually polarized community is interpreted as some kind of demonic relationship. And so it's, although that there doesn't seem to be any kind of obvious family connection between Mary Bliss Parsons and Mary Lewis Parsons, or between Joseph Parsons and Hugh Parsons, that actually that the story of Mary Bliss Parsons does contribute to this sense in Springfield that the devil is hovering around, and that there are people in the community who, through a kind of frailty in their own hearts, is inviting the devil in. And so that successful again from the point of view of the accuser, successful witchcraft accusations are ones where there is a consensus that is at least plausible that people might actually be dealing with Satan. And here we see that cases like this, which are not directly related to the accusations against Hugh and Mary Parsons, are part of a climate of opinion, part of an atmosphere where the devil is insinuating himself into the lives of ordinary people and making it seem that this New England community is under some kind of external demonic attack, perhaps particularly because the people there have been set this task by God to thrive out in the American wilderness, and that they just simply can't live up to it. And that sense of shame and guilt that comes with that sort of failure to live up to God's covenant creates the sort of despair that makes the idea of witchcraft absolutely plausible in their lives.
You said that in addition to suspicion, there are certain other preconditions that need to be met before someone is formally accused of witchcraft. So I'd like to get into those some now. Did part of the tension have to do with the civil wars going on in England?
It's a very good question. I always tend to think about the causes of witchcraft accusations in terms of spheres. You've got this very small sphere at the centre, which is perhaps the individual human heart. And then there's one around it, which is the sense of the self. And then you've got the family, and then another sphere around the household, the neighbourhood, the community. So you're always like layers of an onion, say. You're always working outwards or inwards. And that actually each one of these layers is connected to the one within it, but they're on different scales. And so that at the centre of this story, we've got really a sense of personal despair, anxiety, terror, and marital breakdown. But one of the spheres or layers of the onion, whichever you prefer, which is right at the outside of all this, is the sense of a Puritan transatlantic world which is being turned upside down. Maybe not actually even particularly Puritan. But the period of the Civil Wars is incredibly important because we sometimes think of the British Civil Wars as being, it's a kind of the set piece from the past where people wear funny costumes and, it's a sort of, you see reenactors doing this kind of thing in England. And actually the way that rather belies the fact that at the time, the Civil War was experienced as some kind of end of days, some kind of end of time, some moment before Armageddon, where the whole world was being turned upside down. Now, the Springfield story really takes off in 1649. That's the year in which Charles I, the King of England, is executed. Now, the execution of the King of England is, even for those who were on the side of Parliament during the Civil War, just for listeners, just in case, just make sure everybody knows that there are royalists versus parliamentarians, those who side with the king and those who side with Parliament. But even parliamentarians are shocked by the execution of the king. People who are constantly asking themselves, what is God's will, are forced to ask themselves, did God really want the king to be executed? Now, the likes of Oliver Cromwell and those who signed the king's death warrant are quite sure that they are doing God's will. But there are many who start to think that God put this king on the throne, God ordained monarchy. Are we doing the right thing getting rid of it? And I think that does contribute to a sense of anxiety and turmoil. And we should, of course, also remember that those settlers in New England, in Springfield and right across Massachusetts and Connecticut, throughout New England, everybody's got some relatives in England who they're still in touch with. Many of them go back to see them. About 1 in 10 men in New England go back to fight in English regiments, mostly for Parliament. So there is this traffic, physical traffic of letters and books and ideas that's going back and forth across the Atlantic. So that actually, just because these New Englanders might think of them as proto-Americans, they actually, in their emotions and their feelings, are still very sentimentally attached to England and still call themselves the English and feel that they are still part of England, so that they are worried and very emotional about the consequences of the fighting in England. And so that feeling that maybe if you do the wrong thing, that the devil has somehow got the better of you, and that the devil is raging and very active, or the devil may even be joyful in the face of these calamities, is an essential backdrop to a community like Springfield thinking that perhaps the devil is watching them and that the devil will find some chink in their godly armor and get in there and destroy them from within. Because there is something really important, which I always tell people about, the difference between New England and the sensibilities of its people, which is that although the people in England are heartbroken by war and that they suffer all sorts of anxieties, they never feel that England will cease to exist. Whereas the New England colonies do have that existential fear hanging over them at all times, that maybe actually, if God is disappointed with the results of his experiment by entrusting this covenant to his new Israelites, he'll get rid of them. And there will be some kind of Sodom and Gomorrah reborn in 17th century New England. And of course, by the 1670s, when the wars with the Native Americans really take off, that fear does for a while start to feel like it will come to fruition. And Springfield itself is almost completely destroyed in 1675 as a consequence of those wars. So that existential fear is always hanging over these colonists, and I do think that makes their anxieties rather particular and special.
And then along with that, did the witch panics in the 1640s in East Anglia, how did they affect the witch hunting?
Yeah, that's another very good point. So the witch hunt in East Anglia that goes between 1645 and 7 couldn't really have happened without the Civil War itself. There's a suspension of legal authority. There is disruption of the normal law courts. There are men, in this case, the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern. They come forward because this is a time when Puritan men of action feel that they should take the initiative and that they can, and that they feel that there is a righteous war to be won. So that the English Civil War and the East Anglian witch hunt really do go hand in hand. And then, of course, that the news of the East Anglian witch hunt does go across the Atlantic. So that it's quite obvious that William Pynchon in Springfield knows about what's happened in the East Anglian witch hunt, because they start using techniques and methods which have been used in East Anglia. And that even during a Boston witch trial that takes place a little before this, the Springfield witch hunt, that where William Pynchon himself is sitting as one of the magistrates, they say they need to search the suspect and watch her to see whether the devil's familiars come to her. And they actually say in the record, using the methods as used in England, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but using the method used in England, the surest and the best way. So they're feeling that they're very much of this kind of witch finding moment that's going on in England, and they're going to try to conduct their witch hunt using similar kinds of illegal methods, but ways in which they feel that they can expose a crime which otherwise was being concealed by the devil. But again, I think that all witch hunts, whether they are within New England or whether they're coming across from England, or even news coming from continental Europe, that witch hunts to some extent do breed other witch hunts, because they increase the sense not just that the devil's out there, but that there are actually people who are engaging with the devil, and that they are witches, and that these witches can be stopped. So that if for a crime where people naturally lack confidence, success in witch trials gives them some of the confidence they need. It creates fear, but it creates a degree of confidence actually that we can do something about it.
So we've addressed some preconditions, some layers of the onion. How did New England's economic and social difficulties impact witch hunting?
One of the things that's interesting about witch hunting is that, I think, working backwards from the Crucible and the Salem witch hunts of the 1690s, there's this sense in which Puritans are predisposed to accuse everybody of having the devil in them, accuse witches left, right, and centre. But for the first 20 years or so of permanent settlement in New England, there are just about no witch trials at all. There are different theories and different ways of explaining this, but one theory, which is the one that I think speaks most to me, is that if you go back to England and see what creates the kinds of tensions that then make witchcraft accusations trials happen, they are really about economic conflict between neighbours. They are about competition for resources. They are about overpopulation. They are about anxieties about the poor and difficult feelings about charity. The point about going to America was because England was full and America had lots of land, and all it needed was labour. And actually, it didn't always work out this way, but that was certainly one of those underlying feelings. Somewhere like Boston, originally, when they arrived, 1629, 1630, there is very little there. There is lots of land they can develop. Boston, by 1635, is full, and they have to actually start radiating outwards, because if you arrived in Boston, you don't get some plum piece of land in the centre of Boston, you get moved out. And that's why satellite towns have to be founded. It happens in Springfield as well later on. And lots of little towns get formed around it because that particular piece of land gets full up. But before it gets full up, you get social conflict between neighbours. You get poverty. You get problems about poor relief. You get beggars. You get theft. You get all sorts of crime. And actually, these are some of the ways in which New England starts to resemble Old England quite quickly, and not in a good way. But actually, you get some of those problems. And when you get those kinds of economic preconditions, not macroeconomic conditions, but economic conditions within a community which are problematic, if you've got a belief in witchcraft as well, then you create the kind of tension between neighbours where they start to suspect that maybe someone else is trying to avenge themselves or get the better of them using some kind of demonic power. And once that seed of an idea is planted, that it is almost inevitable you get witchcraft accusations. So, of course, you do get these very English-type accusations in New England. They just take a little bit of time to develop, because you need the right kind of economic problems to develop within a community to allow them to happen.
And what was the situation in Springfield when the witchcraft accusations began there? Had there been enough time for that all to develop?
Yeah, it has. I think that actually Springfield doesn't need all that time, because it starts off already quite competitive. So that these are, as I said before, this isn't a transplanted Puritan congregation, which was the nucleus for so many New England communities in Massachusetts during the 1630s. It's built up from scratch in a very small way initially, but it is rather artificially constructed so that the people that go there, or rather the people that William Pynchon, who attracts there, are, I think, already predisposed to want land and to want authority. When you trace the relations between these neighbours, way after the 1649 to 51 witch hunt, when you go into the 1670s and 1680s, you get the same people, or you get their children, are in the same kind of loggerheads with one another over issues typically of work and money, authority and land. And so that I think it is perhaps a more competitive place, perhaps from the get-go, than some other communities, because it is almost designed that actually that people will fight with each other. And I think this isn't a godless place of saying it. This is a place where Christian charity and Christian worship and Christian piety are extremely important. But that creates its own kind of friction, because for individuals, inevitably, if you're grasping avariciously for your neighbour's land, in your heart and in your mind, you are already at odds with the ideals that are being set down for you. And they are actually ideals, I think, that people take very seriously. And so that the consequence of that are feelings of guilt and shame, as I've said, and that they are exactly the kinds of emotions that the devil would revel in and maybe actually encourage and exploit and so on. So I do think there is something about Springfield which is unusual. And for that reason, I think it does. If there hadn't been a witch hunt in Springfield, but I'd known everything that I know about its economic and social and religious conditions, I'd be asking myself, why not? Because it's just the conditions, I think, are right. And particularly, as happens at Salem later on, the fact that there is a sort of a wobble or a wavering about their legal authority. And William Pynchon becomes a slightly less, I think, reliable natural leader than maybe actually people thought that he was. And that does, for people who feel themselves out on a limb anyway, to lose that faith in their strong leader is actually a rather destabilizing thing.
In the book, you say that witchcraft is an expression of disorder. How was that?
Witchcraft is lots of things. It is a belief and it's a fear, but it's also an ideological emblem. And you get sermons and you get political tract and you get poetry and plays and all sorts of literary forms that draw upon the idea of witchcraft as an ideal world inverted. So that you get witch trials, as we've discussed, during the English Civil War, but that's not just a crime which is generated within communities, which results in legal trials, but it actually it feeds into propaganda, for example, that, of course, in Puritan East Anglia or in Puritan New England, you're going to get witch trials because the people there are so hypocritical. Or the Puritans will say, of course, we're going to get witch trials here because we are so holy and so pious. This is where the devil will try and do his damnedest. So that actually you get this kind of toing and froing about witchcraft as an emblem, an idea of perfect disorder in gender relations, in social relations, within a church, within a community, within a state, and so on. So it always has that ideological function. When there are actually real witchcraft trials, then they become illustrations of that disorder, as if, wow, look at what's happening to this land. It's going to hell in a handcart. So the Bible teaches rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft from the book of Samuel. So this idea of rebellion and of political chaos and of revolution are tied ideologically to this image of witchcraft. And the communities that have witchcraft accusations, like Salem, find that actually the trials themselves become much more socially disruptive than the witchcraft that the trials actually set out to get rid of. There's this tragic, cruel irony. And that Salem and many other places of severe witch hunts do come to realize that. It's almost really losing your temper and saying things you don't mean and then calming down and looking back and slightly objectifying yourself and thinking, I lost control and I'm sorry. Exactly that happens at Salem, but 20 people are dead. And so that this sense of a kind of these emotional volcanoes that then burn themselves out is very much at the heart of the idea of witch hunting. So that witch hunts sometimes when I say feel like a good idea, I'm not even sure people are that consciously thinking about it. I think they can feel righteous. They can feel like a purge. They can feel like a correction to some kind of corruption within a community, but they never quite deliver that sense of purification and of correction at the end of it. On the contrary, they often leave a queasy feeling of regret and of remorse. And to set it in its religious framework, perhaps actually the devil was in us. Perhaps actually when we thought we were fighting the devil, we were the ones who were being manipulated by the devil. And that's what I think happens when your thoughts, when all your actions and all your motivations are keyed to some kind of supernatural superstructure, where you feel that your thoughts and your deeds are constantly, in a very direct way, keyed to the devil's temptations or to God's providential impulses.
What was a witch to New England settlers? It was that person that was getting manipulated by the devil.
Just that question, what is a witch? It's such an incredibly multifaceted and mutable concept. So again, you have the biblical witch and you have the legal witch. The witch is someone who forms a covenant with the devil, but how do you prove that? But in the community, the witch is somebody who was trying to harm you, your household, your domestic interests, your livestock, your crops, and very particularly, and this is really important for the history of witchcraft, your children. Children are so often at the center of witchcraft accusations that the fear of parents towards their children is that most intense emotional experience. The parent who thinks, as I think many parents would, I would die to protect my children. If you take that intensity into a situation where people really do believe that someone is trying to use black magic, in effect, to murder their children, you get the most vicious kind of defensive response. And that vicious defensive response often translates into witchcraft accusations, because witchcraft, the suspicion of witchcraft is often based upon the belief that someone else is jealous and envious and therefore can't have what you have and therefore will just destroy it and spoil it. That anxiety is very common. This is part of the Springfield story as well. There's a lot about children, a lot about women becoming pregnant and about the anxieties around childbirth and about infant mortality, and the sense that in some pregnant women that Hugh Parsons is there, he's watching them or tormenting them when they're giving birth. We might be apt to think, oh, this is just these women just blaming things they didn't understand on Hugh Parsons. They understand perfectly well about the birth pangs of giving birth. They just think that in this case, that this man is responsible for it. And that genuineness, that authenticity of that belief, that sincerity of belief, I think is something which we have to at least accept might be possible in this story, so that we don't just explain it all away and dismiss it, as people so often do, and say, oh, it was just because they didn't like someone, or it's just because they couldn't explain some natural phenomenon. Whereas actually all those kind of evasions from the historical truth ignore the thing that's at the center of it, which is, for these people, the belief in witchcraft was a real thing, and that witchcraft was a real power, albeit one that they found very difficult to identify specifically and even more difficult to prove at law.
You spoke about them needing to be in covenant with the devil. What was the 17th century New England Puritan view of the devil?
There's so much about the New England Law Code departs from English common statute law because they stick very closely to the Mosaic Code. They stick very closely to the Bible. And this is true about Puritans in England as well. The message which they really wanted to get across was that the devil is a malign spirit, the devil is a fallen angel, but is the instrument of God. Because if you start saying that the devil is the enemy of God, you get into kind of heretical grounds, that the devil isn't some negative equivalent of God. God is supreme. And therefore that God uses the devil as an instrument, as a kind of chained servant, in order to tempt the sinful to their own destruction. That's really what they want to teach. And they want to teach, therefore, that the covenant that you have with Satan is in your heart. But these are, both in England and in New England, these are rather abstract theological ideas that are, whether they can be grasped or not, I don't know. Maybe people don't want to believe them. But a lot of ordinary people whose religion is also attached to their sense of folklore and the stories of the woods and the wilds and the wilderness they've grown up with. This is a world where actually supernatural beings like fairies and devils and ogres are tangible. They are actually real monsters that lurk out there. And so that it's very difficult, say, particularly for a child. These are children grow up in these communities who are told about the devil. Children, first of all, understand about monsters. They understand about creatures. They don't understand about abstract ideas about ethereal spirits that might infect your heart. And so that some people, I think, don't necessarily move on from that idea that the devil is some kind of lurking creature. So there is a tension between that theological idea and what we might call a kind of folkloric idea about the devil. Of course, in New England, it's given particular kind of an even stronger tangible sense because of a certain kind of elision between what the Puritan settlers see as godless Native Americans, who many feel that they had tried to bring the gospel to and failed. And they would say that Native Americans don't realize it, but actually, because they don't worship a Protestant God, they're actually worshiping the devil. And particularly when there are political and economic tensions over land and so on that, as I say, erupt in the 1670s, you can get this kind of elision between this idea of demons out there in the wilderness and these demonic Native Americans who really will come into your remote homestead at night and kill people, because of course that's exactly what happens. And those stories are terrifying, and I think do terrify children. There's certainly some evidence of the fear of adults at Salem in the 1690s stems from traumas that they experienced as children during those native wars of the 1670s.
I just want to say that one of the quotes that you had in your book when you were discussing some of that was "let the devil rage." And I just thought that was like put in there perfectly. I loved that thought put in there with the other.
But I think the thing about the devil raging, you see, is that the devil really rages when he feels he's being fought, when he's being faced down. So they said really at the early days of the Reformation that as soon as Martin Luther and the other early Protestants in Germany in the 1520s exposed the Pope as Antichrist, then the devil had to start raging because he'd had a free ride. If you can install Antichrist as the head of the Christian church, then the devil doesn't have to do anything. But the Protestant reformers and the Puritans who go to New England particularly, they feel that there is a shape to this battle that they're fighting. They feel it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And the end will be their righteous victory over Antichrist, and they will get their heavenly reward. And so to think of it in those terms, of this being this series of battles as part of a drawn-out war, then actually we feel that they really do feel, and this is probably true of the witch finders of East Anglia, they feel like they're fighting Satan in the way they can. They can't fight Satan literally hand to hand, but they can fight those who have truck with Satan. And that is sometimes difficult for us to grasp because all we can see is barbarism and cruelty and persecution. But if we're to try to, rather than to judge it, but if we, as historians, to try and understand it, which is not at all to, as I say, to exonerate or make excuses for, but if we actually try and understand it, I think that sometimes the motives which seem barbaric to us were more sincere because they took very seriously the idea that there was a war, not just that they could fight, but that they actually felt it was their duty to fight.
In their fight, they took action against suspected witches. What was the penalty for witchcraft in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and what was that based upon?
Okay, so the Massachusetts Bay does follow English common law. The penalty is hanging. Now, hanging in this world was extremely unpleasant. It didn't break the neck. This is where you strangled to death at the end of a rope. We're much more familiar with the mass kind of bonfires, the burning of witches, which was certainly true in Scotland and was also true in most continental inquisitions. But you get different legal systems, they have different consequences. But the witch hangings are sensational events where mass crowds would turn out to see them. But they were comparatively rare because the legal process didn't hurry people. Again, this is a sort of a myth that we have, where as soon as somebody's suspected, they're hurried along to their execution. The legal process actually more works towards acquittal than it does towards conviction. And this is one of those surprising facts. But even those people who did find themselves being acquitted, it wasn't necessarily the case that they just then slotted back into the community. I think that there's a whole history of witchcraft that isn't very well documented, which is actually what happens after unsuccessful trials, after acquittals. Where do people go? How do they go? How do people treat them after that? Are they sorry? Are they ashamed? I think a lot of the time the people actually do have to go, because it's just too awful and awkward to live amongst the people who actually tried to have you executed and failed. How can you look someone in the eye who was actually very happy to see you executed the day before? So I think that, and of course, in the Springfield story, that people, well, like Mary Bliss Parsons, that they don't stay in Springfield. They do go to Northampton, but as is so often the case, your past follows you around, and it's much harder to make a clean start than maybe they think, because actually the rumours begin. And of course, this happens to one of the other characters in The Ruin of All Witches, a woman called Mercy Marshfield. And she arrives in Springfield for family reasons from Windsor, further down the Connecticut Valley. And it's not long before the rumours start. Mary Parsons starts saying, oh, she's brought the devil with her. Now, this all massively backfires against Mary Parsons. In this case, interestingly, it doesn't mean that everybody starts whispering about Mercy Marshfield and then Mercy Marshfield is accused of the witch. Actually, on the contrary, it all blows up in Mary Parsons' face and it works against her. But just that insinuation of the idea that somebody might be bringing the devil with them, I think shows us that it's very difficult just to arrive in a new place from somewhere else and for nobody there to know nothing about you whatsoever.
You said in your book, witches are paradoxically everywhere and nowhere, which made prosecuting them so urgent and so difficult.
So there's some very interesting anthropological work about this, about the way that witchcraft exists in tribal communities today, or certainly in recent years. And they have this idea too, this idea that everybody believes in witchcraft. Everyone's afraid of witchcraft. Witchcraft is all around. But nobody can quite pin it down on anybody. It's always glimpsed out of the corner of your eye. It's always a feeling about somebody that you wouldn't quite like to translate into pointing the finger at somebody. And that's really what I meant by that. Is the idea it is absolutely all around, but that doesn't mean to say, and again, it's one of those cliches, I think, of witchcraft, that witchcraft was all around. That meant that everybody's always pointing at somebody else and accusing them because they don't understand or explain things, and they don't like people and so on. Actually, most of the time, they do nothing. And the problem with doing nothing in history is it doesn't leave a lot of records. We don't have records of people doing nothing. But I think we have to assume a lot of the time that's what happens in the history of witchcraft, because it stays as a kind of ethereal abstraction, not just as an idea, but even something that you feel about somebody. Because witchcraft is always about fear as well. If you're frightened of somebody in your community, you don't stand on a box and point the finger at them. You stay out of their way. And so it's an important thing with the history of witchcraft, I think, just to use our imagination about what we would do. How would we be? Now, we're not absolutely the same as them. Of course we're not. But there is a degree of common sense. Actually, what I'd probably do is just be polite, stay out of their way, keep your mouth shut, try not to antagonize them, but try not to ostracize them either. I think that is almost certainly what most people do most of the time. It's only really when the suspicions against somebody reach a kind of critical mass and something happens to trigger it. And quite often that is the fear of a mother about her child, because that's when, all caution is thrown to the wind and they feel actually they're consumed by this kind of rage and fear It means that they will actually stand up in public and say, I think that person is a witch, and I think that person bewitched my child. But behind that's the tip of the iceberg, and the submerged 99% of the iceberg is all the stuff that often doesn't leave much of a trace in the historical record, because actually it's that part of the iceberg that doesn't actually amount to anything in the end, because accusations just go nowhere. Or people just keep them private. And I think we've covered an awful lot of ground, but I think I'd just say just one concluding remark is that it's that when we look at the documentation, the evidence we have for the history of witchcraft of many different types, I think we have to remember, it's important to remember that it's what makes that all stick together in a witch hunt is emotion, toxic emotions of envy and fear and anger and rage. And these are, of course, this is where we can bring something of ourselves into the past, because although we apply these emotions to different situations and in different circumstances, and maybe we're better at restraining them, who knows, that really these are things which we can identify within our own lives, and they're things which I think are absolutely central to making witchcraft accusations happen. So really, my final remark really is just a kind of a plea for some imagination history, and that imagination really in witch hunting is to think, what part do these emotions play? Because once you get the emotions in action within a story, I think it makes a lot more sense than it might do otherwise.
I feel like I know what this book is going to mean to American readers. How is it different than what it means to the UK?
I suppose that'd be interesting to see what the response of the American audience is. But for the UK response to it so far, I think that a lot of people have responded to it in one of the ways in which I pitched it, which is a kind of a real life fairy tale. And the thing about fairy tales is they don't really exist anywhere. And they don't actually always exist in a set particular time. They feel like the distant but not too distant past, and they feel like a distant but not too distant place, but still you can identify with it. And I hope actually that American readers will respond to it in the same way, rather than just seeing it as a piece of American history, because I think actually that many of the themes in it, the human story behind it, are universal, although obviously it will have, I think, interest to people in New England and Connecticut and Massachusetts, and perhaps even particularly in Springfield as well. We'll have to wait and see what Springfielders make of it.
It has that fairy tale feel. And when Josh and I were reading through it and talking a little bit as we read, when you go through a fairy tale, sometimes you read a chapter or two chapters, and then, the next day you come to it again, and you've thought it was very much like that for me. I had to take breaks. I had to process the emotion of what I was feeling. I would send Josh messages or turn to whoever was near me, and I'm like, I feel enraged. I feel scared. I feel the desperation of these women. And you picture the surroundings and all of it. It was just phenomenal.
That's great to hear. Obviously, I don't want to manipulate anyone else's emotions, but I'm obviously pleased that you had that kind of visceral response to it, because that's really what I was hoping for. One of the worst things, isn't it, about history, the history of witchcraft or any history, is that people feel that it's dead and that it's gone. And I think by putting the emotions back into the story, you can understand it. But also equally, we can make these stories live in the present, because after all, they are dead in the past. They only exist for us. History only ever really exists in the present, doesn't it? Where else could it be? So that it should, I think, mean something to us. I think we should, and maybe even we learned something about ourselves. And witchcraft is one of those things where we feel very different from our ancestors. But actually, when you look at the emotions that lead to witchcraft accusations, I hope there's a chastening effect that actually we're really not so different from them. And maybe we're prone to some of the same paranoia and the same persecuting impulses as our ancestors 300-400 years ago were.
It's also a handbook. As your book has so many parallels in it, for me, it has those two parallels. It's the fairy tale and narrative, but it's also a handbook for understanding.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Now here's Sarah with another important update on the witch hunts happening now.
Witch hunt happenings in your world. Here at Thou Shalt Not Suffer podcast, along with the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project, we have prioritized remembering the stories and names of innocent witch hunt victims in North America. These victims are from the 17th century. We have the benefit of time passing and can look back at past history and right some wrongs. But on the continent of Africa, South African Pagan Alliance's advocacy against witch hunts is in the living situation of real witch hunts. It's not a historical situation. The families of those killed for witchcraft are still living in fear within those communities where killings motivated by superstitious fear are active threats and have harmed their loved ones. The witch hunting is intending to stop evil, but the murdering is the evil. And rural South African community members are not safe from it. Podcast listener Damon Leff of the Alliance, legal professional and witch hunt advocate, has kept a record of reported cases. That project is called Remembering Their Names, Victims of Witch Hunts in South Africa, 2000 to 2021. We recently spoke with Damon Leff of the Alliance, who has informed us of the advocacy's progress and work with South African leadership. We are so appreciative that he reached out to help us bring awareness to all witch hunts. His advocacy brings the matter of the living situation of witch hunts in African countries to us, and we must respond. His advocacy brings the matter of the living situations of the witch hunts in African countries to you, and you must pay attention. Stay tuned. As you've seen, we are highlighting art that stands against the witch hunt. Art is a powerful and special message, and I am so thrilled to see it working to educate the right message about witch hunting being a crime. However, some art is still not sending the needed message. Witch hunt murders are happening on our planet, yet some American singing and baking artists use the witch burning image lightheartedly to further their art. This choice perpetuates the acceptance of persecuting other. It has a clear message, and that message is that the witch was real, she was to blame, and we killed her. It's a murder message. Those men and women represented on a burning pyre were innocent, not in a devil pact. Yes, this sounds strong, and maybe it sounds inflexible, unimaginative. It most certainly is a strong and inflexible request I am making to stop witch fear. Many art forms are making efforts to educate against witch hunts, and it's now out of touch to continue ostentatious use of the image of a witch burning in the flames. We have witch hunting to stop. We still have the flames of witch fear to stomp out. So, citizens of the USA, I urge you, now that you know what's happening, if you get out your frosting and ganache for a witch interpretation, think twice about what you're saying with our image. Performers, put your microphone all the way up and stand against witch killing instead of drawing a crowd with a witch burning theme. Harm is happening to innocent humans while we educate. Listeners, let's support the countries in Africa and across the world where innocent people are being targeted by superstitious fear. Support them by acknowledging and sharing their stories. Please use all your communication channels, including your art form, to intervene, not disregard the victims. Stand with them. Talk about what you have learned here.
Thank you, Sarah, for that informative segment.
You're welcome.
And thank you for listening to Thou Shalt Not Suffer, the Witch Trial podcast.
Join us next week for Dr. Danny Buck. There's something for people on both sides of the Atlantic. Something for William and Joanna Town descendants. And we'll be comparing Great Yarmouth to Salem. Dr. Danny Buck studied under Malcolm Gaskill.
Like, subscribe, or follow wherever you get your podcasts.
And visit us every week at thoushallnotsuffer.com.
Remember to tell all your friends, family, co-workers, and neighbors about Thou Shalt Not Suffer, the Witch Trial podcast.
Goodbye for now.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.